Welcome to Ranting and Raving. Another day, another draft video. Today we're going to talk about wide receiver. The interesting thing about this receiver class is it's not full of guys who you necessarily expect to be game breakers the way a lot of most recent classes have been. Um, but at the same time, it's a lot deeper class than it's being presented as. Um, to a certain degree, I feel the same way about the quarterback class. Like this quarterback class gets talked about, which we discussed in the last video. Um, it gets talked about as if it's like the Kenny Pickett draft. It's a lot better than that, but it's not like last year's draft. And I kind of look at the wide receiver draft the same way. So we're going to go over a number of players here. We're going to look at 9 guys. So certainly did not watch every receiver in the draft. Don't have an opinion on every receiver in the draft, but these are the guys I'm looking at. Really, most from rounds 1 through 3 is really kind of where my main area of focus has been. And same grading system as always. So prospect tiers, targeted ranges, a little bit of their physical attributes, my initial thoughts. And just a reminder, a gimme, as always, is a player who you would sprint to the podium to draft within their expected draft range. So you can have a third round gimme player. Obviously, you can have a player that would be a gimme in the top 10 or the top 20, so on and so forth. It's not like this is a top 5 player in the draft, but it is certainly a player where I'm very high on them for a variety of reasons. So, with all of the BS out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking prospects. So, first on the list, the top guy for me for the Saints to be looking at to draft, partially because I think I think he's one of 2 to 3 guys who you could argue are top 10 to 20 ish picks in this draft. I don't think there's a receiver in this draft that's a top 5 guy. I think McMillan is definitely a top 10 guy. There's, I'll talk about it at the end when I show my initial thoughts, but when I watched him, there's a particular receiver who's currently in the league that immediately popped into my head. What's funny is I've seen a lot of other people compare him to someone else who we'll also talk about in a minute. Um, let's just talk about his measurable. 6'4", 220 pounds, rounding up. Ran a 4.55. Now 4.55 at 220 pounds, 6'4" is actually really good. Like, look, Calvin Johnson ran in the 4.3s. Calvin Johnson happens once. Like, to have that complete package, we're not comparing anybody here to Calvin Johnson. If there was a Calvin Johnson in this draft, we wouldn't be talking about it being a weak class. I absolutely would take him in the top 10. I have absolutely no issue taking him at 9. So he's a guy to me, he isn't a guy who wins immediately off the line, especially like with route running. Um, he's not a bad route runner, but he's not like, a Michael Thomas where he's just destroying you at the line of scrimmage. Also think that's something you can coach up and improve over time. I also think to a certain degree, um, for the archetype of receiver, I think he is. It's less important. First of all, his height um, is a huge factor in that. There's just the reality of you can throw balls to places with him where separation is less important. He can separate via his frame rather than just having to separate off the line of scrimmage. His height weight combination, like just the components there, gives him the ability to just out muscle, out physical a lot of players, even if he can't, again, necessarily route them up. And he's not a bad route runner. He's just not a great route runner. The big thing with him, though, is especially with modern offenses, you can run him in stacks, you can run him in crossers, and he's a guy who really thrives down the field, but also across the middle of the field and in space. He has a really good natural feel for once the ball's in his hands, getting yards after the catch. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I'm such a big fan of his is he brings all those elements on top of the large frame, the big body, and fantastic hands. So to me, like I said, he's one of the three wide receivers you can argue he's the best in the class. And the comp, so first I'll say that the one I see as I actually look at him as um, I think he reminds me a lot of Mike Evans. There's a lot of Mike Evans to his game. The high pointing, the physicality, the movement skills in space, the style of play. There's a lot of similarities there. Now he didn't play at Texas A&M with Johnny Manziel, and to a large degree didn't make Johnny Manziel a thing the way Mike Evans did, and so he's not hyped the same. But similar body type, similar frame, similar play style to me. The guy I've seen him compared to is Drake London. I push back on that a little bit just because I think Drake London is a little bit more of a violent route runner. I think he's a little bit more of like he's a dig guy, a corner guy. Like he's Drake London's a little bit more of a 11 catches for 135 and two touchdowns day guy, and less of a five catches for 150 and two touchdowns guy. McMillan's more the latter. He can like he's a guy you can give you like 8, 9, 10 catches. Like you can feed him the ball, especially with like his frame and especially like within the confines of an offense. But like that's not really his game. He's not a volume possession receiver as much as he is a guy who he's gonna draw coverage because if you don't roll coverage to him, he's going to break open at some point. He's going to catch the ball in space and he's going to be a problem and he's a guy who can rip off those 35, 45, 55, 65, etc. plays. And the one thing that got shown with his 40 time, which there's an asterisk there because it's at a pro day and pro day 40s are always a little bit of like, but again, like that's roughly the same range as you saw Mike Evans run. And you're looking at a taller, longer limbed guy. His 50 is going to be more impressive than his 40, and his 60 is going to be more impressive than his 40. Just because of the stride and the way he runs. He's not slow and plodding. He does get up to speed. You see that on plays where he gets out in space. He does pull away from guys, but he doesn't get up to speed immediately. So it's just a different style of receiver. Good coaches can work with that. Good quarterbacks can work with that. And again, just the size, the hands, the catch radius, the willingness to be physical, all of those elements, instant gimme for me. If he's there at 9, barring another guy who's a gimme who, like for example, a quarterback or a running back. There's one guy in the draft who probably could and should go top 10. Like barring those players, I just take T Mac. It's that simple. Tedoroy McMillan to me is the best receiver in this draft, but there's a couple of guys in that conversation. Speaking of guys in that conversation, I've had some friends who see Luther Burden third as the best receiver in this draft. I don't. Um, so for me, he's a round two guy. I think he probably gets taken higher than that. He runs a 4.41. He's 206, 6 feet tall. No, no bad measurables at all. He's not Tavon Austin. He's not like a 5'6" speedster that's just not going to do anything in the league. Like he's a legit dude. So he plays even bigger than he is. Like he's quote unquote got that dog in him, and it's not like a Costco hot dog. Like he really brings the goods. But to me, it's not that he cannot play receiver. Like he is not a pure gadget player. Let's not make that mistake. However, he is more of a gadget slash weapon type player than a guy where it's like, okay, well, he's going to beat you vertical, or he's going to kill you on routes, across the middle of the field or on possessions, or get all that out physical you with his body and his skill set. Like those aren't the archetype he falls on. He's a guy where he's a joystick player. He's electric with the ball in his hands. You're going to want to get the ball in his hands a bunch of different ways. You could do it on, reverses, on tosses, on sweeps, on screens. Can get, receptions down the field as well. He's not an amazing route runner, which again is like it's not the end of the world. It's not the only thing, and it's something guys can improve. But just stylistically, he's the type of guy where you need to surround him with other talent that creates the environment where he's most lethal. You need to create situations where you can get the ball into his hands. And then he's an incredibly dynamic part of your offense. To me, like I mentioned Tavon Austin earlier, well, he was really tiny. That was part of his biggest problem. Debo Samuel is another guy. Like to me, he's a lot like Debo Samuel. Now Tavon, for the record, was a better like pure receiver than Debo. A little bit, but a lot of them, both of them had that like gadget joystick element. I do see that element with Luther Burden. Again, he's 6 foot 206. Like he's not a little dude. He's not huge for an NFL receiver, but he's like perfectly acceptable size. But again, he's that joker, that chess piece that get the ball in his hands and let him go to work. But you need other pieces around him for that to work. You can't build a passing game around him. And that's to me the reason why I don't have him as my top receiver in this draft. He could very well be the most impactful receiver taken in this draft, depending on who gets it. Like if he goes to the Lions, it will be highly problematic if the Lions get their hands on him, even with Jared Goff as the quarterback. Jaden Higgins. So another 6 foot guy. Um, Weight is 214. So 6 foot 214 is actually pretty darn good size for a wide receiver. So again, like not super tall, but 214 for a receiver is actually pretty thick. Ran a 4.47. He's got that bigger, thicker frame plays to it. To me, he's around 2 to 4 guy. Like maybe you take him in the second, just depending on like if there's a run there, depending on what you got in the first. Did you trade down? Did you get extra assets? Like situationally speaking, I wouldn't be mad if they took him in the second. Like that's not an overdraft, although I hate that term. You're only overdrafting a player if they don't work out, or if like you pull like a Ricky Williams. Like they obviously overdrafted Rick Williams the entire draft for him. But like outside of those types of scenarios, like I just hate the term. So anywhere in that round 2 to 4 range, again, like plays to his physicality, has like a lot of yards after catchability, which I found impressive. I don't see a guy who is like a wide receiver one from the perspective of this is a guy who is going to dominate a game plan. Because that's really to me what a wide receiver one is. I don't look at it as like the fantasy football perspective. I don't really care what your fantasy wide receiver one is. To me, a wide receiver one is a guy who, when the opposing coaches are creating their game plan going into the week, this is a player we have to have a plan for or it will be problematic. Like that's a number one, RB1, wide receiver one, tight end one, so on and so forth. Like a guy where it's not like, hey, we're just going to run our stuff and we'll be fine. If that's the level of player, like that's not a top guy. A top guy should force you to shift coverage. It's the top person you're focusing on. Then a good wide receiver one obviously has the ability to exceed despite that. Like, okay, cool, you game planned around me and I still found a way to succeed, to produce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or I made you over focus resources so much that it opened up the entire rest of the offense. Like now we're talking about tiers and stratas. But I think he's a guy where he can get open deep. He can be a chain mover. He falls within the archetypes of what the Saints need. I'm a fan, but I'm not like over the moon for him. But again, he's a gimme player. Um, just from the perspective of he brings a lot of the elements that the Saints need, specifically that chain moving and physicality element. Now, obviously, you can noticing these guys aren't necessarily all in order. And Emeka Egbuka, um, personally might be my favorite receiver in this draft. He's a threat for the Saints to draft him. Now you'll see the 40 time there is a question mark because he didn't run at the combine, and I don't have his pro day data, and I'm just not gonna wait to make the video. and just watch the tape. He's clearly not slow. I'm not worried about it. He's probably somewhere in the 4.4s. 6'1", 202. I'd take him top 20. He's an instant gimme player. Like he's a guy. It's one of those things like you don't necessarily take him at 9, but if they took him at 9, I wouldn't lose my shit. I'd be like, oh wow, they took him at 9, and like that would be it. We're like, okay, cool. I think he's an extremely good player. Again, I don't believe in overdrafting. If you would take him at 16, but you wouldn't take him at 9, that should only be because of the guys who were also there at 9 that you would have taken over the player. Not like, oh well, I had him as my 17th best prospect in the draft. Like, who gives a shit? If you got a good productive player, unless the opportunity cost was a way better, way more elite player was also there who's also at a position of need, that opportunity cost, yeah, you don't take the player. You don't quote unquote overdraft. Otherwise, stupid term, not gonna I promise I won't go over it every time I touch prospect. Um the thing with him is like he's got that whole Ohio State wide receiver thing in that like he's just good at playing the position and like if you remember the last video where we talked about quarterbacks, one of the reasons why I'm a bit higher on Shador Sanders than some people are going into the draft is I actually put a lot of value on are you just good at playing football? Like to a certain degree, like yeah, running fast, being strong, having enough weight, being able to take hits, like all those things, yeah, it matters for a receiver. But like also like just are you good at football? Because there's lots of guys who do amazing at the combine, who put up crazy numbers, like that one defensive end this year, whose name I've refused to learn because he has 2.5 sacks his entire collegiate career. Like, I don't care what you tested at. You're not good at football. You should be a fifth round pick or go try out for the Olympics or WWE or something. But, like, you're not good at football. The first round is not where you take players who aren't good at football. See the Colts and Anthony Richardson. Maybe we'll start learning this lesson someday. They won't. They won't. They'll never learn. They'll never fucking learn. NFL GMs will never learn. It's so frustrating. Anyway, back to Omega. Again, he's that classic Ohio wide receiver, Ohio State wide receiver archetype. So speed size combo, polished route runner, good hands, can work it over the middle of the field, can work down the field. You can pretty much put him anywhere. He's very much he's the guy who is most the archetype you think of when you think of a number one wide receiver in this class. And the only reason to me he isn't getting that hype, if he had gone to the combine and run a 4.36, just pulling a number out of the air, 4.36, 4.39, instead of like a 4.42, or or 4.4, which is what I think he's probably going to run. Like he would be all of a sudden people would magically realize, oh yeah, he was really really good at Ohio State. And he was a huge part of them winning a national championship. And yes, like the freshman was out of this universe good, but so was he, and he was good last year, and his film was really good, and he's good at pretty much everything, and has plenty of speed and athleticism to beat deep. Has the ability to win short. Like this is a complete receiver. This is a guy where you can build a game plan around. Thus, wide receiver one. So he's one of my three guys that, again, top 20 player, instant gimme. If the Saints drafted him at 9, if another teamer takes him in the top 20, you're probably going to be really, really happy with him. I think he's a lot better than he's getting credit for. Not like clearly not a Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson, but like those guys are extraordinary anomalies. Um, but he's really, really good, and I expect him to be really, really good. Next guy on the list. So to talk about a prototypical wide receiver one, and then a antithetical wide receiver one. So Trey Harris, 6'2", 205, ran a 4.5, 440. Um, they're not the same player, but just to help conceptualize who this guy is for people who haven't watched him as much. DeAndre Hopkins. Like, that's who he is. He's a biggish body, good route runner, really good hands, excellent body control, and just really, really good at football, really, really good when the ball is in the air, and like really good at catching the ball, which is his job. Like it's one of those things. He's very easy to overthink, especially because of that 4-5, and he's one of those players. He's not going to be what he isn't. Now he's not some like incredible route runner like Michael Thomas was, but again, there's multiple ways to win, and that's also something you can improve on. But he's a guy who's not getting the hype that he could be getting. His top end speed isn't great. His initial get off's actually pretty nice. I like his gait. I like his quickness. His short area quickness is really, really good. Like, I actually don't think he's going to have a huge issue um, creating separation at the NFL level. Like, he's not massive. He's not 6'5", but 6'2" is again not a small receiver. Again, he has those really good ball skills, and actually is quite good in the open field. So anywhere where rounds 2 to 4, I fully expect him to be taken somewhere in the second round. If he's there in the third, like that's even more of like a gimme guy. But like he's one of those guys you don't need to overthink it. Again, it kind of depends on your board, but specific to the Saints, the one thing they desperately need is a possession receiver with size, whether that is a tight end, and we'll talk about a few options for that in that upcoming video, or a wide receiver, or both. They need a chain mover desperately. Whether you're stuck with dummy Carr at quarterback for another year, or if it's Spencer, or if it's Shador, or whoever, they need someone who is of real size with good hands and a strong frame, who can work the intermediate areas, who can work the field, who can move the chains, who can keep the offense on time, on schedule, and who can catch the occasional high ball. Because as it turns out, Drew Brees is pretty rare. Like there's only been like one, and there's like six guys, maybe probably ever in that echelon. Period. So yeah, you need to bring in better weapons than you had to when you had like you know god tier quarter play. Not that complicated of a thought. Next guy on the list. Um, there's like this natural perfect comp for essentially who this guy is, which we'll kind of get into in a second. So he's 6'4", he's 222, he runs a 4.48. Um, I'm very high on him. Now, the last guy who had crazy combine numbers, who went to TCU and got drafted, has been a boost. Um, but Savion, I don't think he's going to get taken in the first round. So Savion Williams is the same player that Luther Burden is, but less polished. And what I mean by that is not like the same player, same archetype. He's a gadget player. He could be a running back. He can actually throw the ball. Like throw it quite well. I think he was like high school quarterback. They've had him throw plays. Like he's actually like reasonably decent at like throwing the ball legitimately. Like you could run some like wildcat plays off of him. He is a good enough athlete. 6'4", 220 pounds, runs a 4.4. Like this is a guy, if you wanted to keep the Taysom Hill type player and have that like become part of the Saints identity, and like we love having this kind of guy, we want to bring in another guy to maybe do that. Savion is the right archetype and the right type of diverse athlete to be able to do that. Now again, there's only one Taysom Hill, so we're just talking like archetypes here. It's not like he's going to be a 1-to-1, but like that's the type of thing he could be. But that's not who I actually think he is. I think it's Cordell Patterson. Like, is he a receiver? Is he a running back? Yes. Yes, he's both. Um, he's a little bit bigger, a little bit more athletic, but like he's just basically he's a guy. If you get him, find ways to get the ball in his hands, and ideally get the ball in his hands and find a way to get him in space, and he's going to do some really filthy things to oppositions. Um, the issue and the reason why he's a round 3 to 5 pick, and the reason he's not a gimme, is because while he's an incredible athlete, especially like size, weight, speed combo. Again, if you're taller and heavier, running faster is more impressive, and his agility on tape is really impressive too. So it's not just straight line speed. His athleticism is really impressive. It's his lack of polish. Like the higher up in the draft you take a player, the more reliable it should be to predict them to be a contributor in the NFL. And the further up you go, like you want more than a contributor, you want like a star, an impact player, a cornerstone of your franchise, etc. Like the higher up you go, the more you need to be able to rely on the player. They don't have to be perfect, but you need to be able to go, hey, these three things this guy does at an elite level, it's going to be super reliable for me to look at that player and they're going to do those three things all the time, and I can write it in. That's the problem with Savion Williams. It's to a degree, it's the jack of all trades, master of none, but it's also like the jack of all trades thing with like RNG, random number generator, for those who don't play video games. Um, he's literally rolling the dice. On any given play, you get the ball in his hands, it could be spectacular, or like you could design a play for him and he drops it or he fumbles it or just doesn't run the route crisp enough, or so on and so forth. Like, this is not a guy yet you can build an offense around, but if it clicks for him, if it all clicks, devastating player. Dude could be an absolute stud. Next guy on the list. If Matthew Golden had Emeka Ibuka's measurables, he would be without question the number one wide receiver in this draft. It's that simple to me. If he was 6'1" or 6'2" and 200-ish pounds, he would, without question, be the number one receiver in the draft. 4.29 40, blazing speed, but not just fast, not just straight line fast. Really, really good route runner. Gets phenomenal separation in his routes, partially obviously because of the speed, but also uses that speed not just to blow by guys, but as a weapon. Force you to overcompensate, get you going one way, go the other, instantly accelerate, bam, 10-yard separation. Even, Mr. Mullet can hit that throw. Um, so Matthew Golden is a guy, he's such an easy eval for me because if you watch how he wins and how he makes plays, when the ball is up in the air, he makes plays. He's good at mossing people. He's good at contested catches. He can run a diverse route tree, good hands, obviously fast as hell, extremely dynamic and explosive. Like, he's a guy, that's the type of speed where you don't have to be huge. If no one can get close enough to you to stop you, you can be the number one wide receiver. Like, he can be a Deshaun Jackson type. I think he's a little bit better at like contested catches than Deshaun was. But like, if you think of Deshaun Jackson and you're like, oh, I see it. Like, he can't be a number one. There've been a few. Now there's not a ton, but there could be a few. If he was 6'1", 200 pounds, 6'1", 6'2", 200 pounds, like, it would not be remotely close. He would be the number one receiver in this draft. No one would be talking about anybody else. He's not. He's 5'11", 190, and my biggest question is, can he put on 10 pounds by the time the season starts? Can he get to 200-ish? Fill the frame out just a little bit. Fill out your chest, fill out your core, like, to protect himself and have just a little bit more meat on his bones. If he can get there without like completely sacrificing his speed and agility, like, someone's going to draft this guy in the first round, and he's going to be a problem unless he ends up with a like really bad quarterback. And even then, it might not matter. Like, he might just be one of those guys where a really bad quarterback just goes, he's down there somewhere and throws it, and he makes big plays. Like, that's a thing that could happen. So he's one of my big three wide receivers. It's him, it's T-Mac, and Ibuka. Like, those three guys are guys I'd take in the top 20 and not really stress about it. Everyone else, to a degree, I have questions or concerns. Speaking of questions or concerns, Xavier Restrepo is, I think he's one of the biggest wild card guys in this draft. So like I've seen some people compare him to Lad McConkey, and Lad McConkey is a far better athlete than Restrepo. Like they are similar stylistic. Restrepo is just like Lad McConkey wearing a weight vest. It's kind of how I would describe him. Um, he's not crazy fast. He's not crazy, quick. He is reasonably strong, like 5'10", 210. Like he's a Welba guy. He's a slot receiver, and he's a guy. So if Shanahan, if he makes it to the third round, and Kyle Shanahan gets his hands on him, like this guy's going to make a Pro Bowl. Like he's that type of receiver. If you get him in more of a West Coast style offense, type of offense that's going to use a slot receiver, and especially if you're like building in option routes and like, or God, if you give Sean Payton him, if Sean Payton drafts him in like the second or the third round, like he's gonna be a problem because he's tough as hell. He's got the right frame to work the middle of the field. He's got yards after catch ability. He's dynamic enough. Did I mention tough as hell? And I just think he's one of the safer picks in this class. He's not a guy that I don't like see him turning a team around and like becoming your number one wide receiver. But I think he's a guy who can be your number wide receiver two or wide receiver three if you're loaded, and just be incredibly impactful and very reliable and very consistent in ways that have a very meaningful impact on passing games. Did I mention tough as hell? Like, and that's a huge part of like the archetype of player he is. You have to be tough and you have to be physical in order to have success, and he is. But again, he's not slow. Like he's not like running like a 4.7, and like he's just big and tough and physical and look good in college. Like he's not like Quan Treadwell, who's just 5'10". Like this guy can ball. But I just don't see him as like a first couple of rounds prospect. And he's a guy you need to check some other boxes on your roster before like he's the ideal fit. But if you check those boxes, like he's gonna be a problem. So the next guy I have on my list here is Alec uh, Ayomanar. Ayomanar. I don't know. I'm probably butchering the hell out of that. Um, Somebody in one of the discords I'm in, he just basically called him. What did he call him? Ivy League Michael Thomas. 6'2", 206. Now he runs a 4.4, so he's definitely faster than Mike. But if you watch him play, like you see the parallels, a little bit shorter, not quite as thick. He's a fantastic route runner. He's every bit of a possession receiver. Like this guy is a chain mover. This guy is the exact archetype I talked about earlier. I mentioned Trey Harris. If I had the option as the Saints to draft Trey Harris or Alec, let's say you took Genty at 9 or Shador at 9, especially if you took Shador at 9, Alec by a mile. Like he's just a perfect fit for a guy like Shador. Um, but even in a vacuum, I'm taking Alec first. I'd be really happy with either of them, but he's just the better athlete. But also, more specifically, he is a true possession receiver, chain mover, but he has that extra dimension of explosiveness where he's a little bit more athletic than you think he is. And he gets out in open space and he can make some bigger plays. And I talked earlier about T Mac. Like T Mac is not that 11 for 135 and 2 touchdowns guy. Alec is. Now because of the 4.4 speed, now he could be a guy where it's like 7 for 135 and 2 touchdowns. Big game. See the five unless like busted coverage. And busted coverage, like Traquan Smith has some games like that because of busted coverages, but like with a relatively reasonable level of reliability, I just don't see. But he's not a guy that would need a dozen catches to hit those types of numbers because of the athletic traits, the route running, the abilities he's demonstrated, the hands, etc. Like he's a very, very high level prospect. Would absolutely love to draft him. Like I think he's a really, really easy evaluation, and I think he's a perfect complement to a guy like Chris Olave because Olave is number one. He's also fast as hell. He's a filthy route runner, but he is a guy where you can run them in a stack. Now you can have both of them can go inside, but like you can send Olave outside. And what you can do is you can create a situation where the defense now has to make a choice. If we dedicate extra coverage, like a safety to Olave, we potentially protect ourselves from getting beat deep. But now we have a 6'2", 206, 4'4" guy who's a really good route runner who, if he shakes free, like could pop off a big play at any time. So you can't really leave him one on one. And if you put him in the slot and you get him on a linebacker, the linebacker is dead to rights. That's a first down. Pencil it in and keep moving. Unless Derek Carr's your quarterback, and then who knows? Might get the receiver killed. Might throw it in the fifth row. Roll those dice. Let's see what it comes up with. But yeah, just purely as a prospect, almost an ideal player for what the team needs as an archetype. So would absolutely love to. And that makes up the list. So that is everybody I looked at. That's all 9 guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, like, comment, subscribe, all those things. If you feel like it helps the channel, helps all those things. Um, if you disagree or agree or have any comments or anything like that on any of these prospects, go ahead and drop them in the comment section. I usually respond. Love to hear everybody's thoughts. More content coming here soon.